What does that kind of vulnerability, that reciprocity, that long-term kind of commitment to one another, what does that say to our American culture that claims individualism and strength and power? What does it say to our American culture that craves pleasure in the moment, buy now, pay later? You know, that kind of mentality crashed, and it's going to continue to crash. I believe that one of the reasons why marriage and family is so difficult is that it's so countercultural to live with such a life of blessing in marriage. It's counterculture to our culture. It's countercultural probably to most cultures that are secular, because most culture is about selfishness. And we can look at our own and we can see that. A 50% divorce rate, one-night stands, people sleeping together while barely knowing each other's name. The wedding industry is a boom industry, yet marriages are insignificant. All too often, I'm afraid that marriage is about the dress and the day. The princess fairy tale moment, not the lifetime. And that's the water we swim in as 21st century believers. If you have any doubt of it, flip on television. Bridezilla. How to marry a millionaire. You know, we're so worried about the institution of marriage and about it being defiled, and yet we watch people trying to marry millionaires on TV. We watch as superstars get married in some drunken state and then the next day get divorced. This is the question that we're asking ourselves right now. What constitutes this holiness? And what seems to constitute it, I think, is something that my mentor, Catherine Wallace, said, and I want to read to you from her book because she's, I think, far more articulate about this point. It remains crucial to recognize how easily and how profoundly we fall into exploiting one another in marriage. Money, household work, emotional support, child care, in-laws, career demands, such issues are part and parcel of the sexual ethics because these are among the ordinary sources of vulnerability to each other's greediness, laziness, ambition, egotism, and so forth. Trusting each other's integrity demands that marriage is not a mechanical or a quid pro quo arrangement, but rather the gutsiest, most nitty-gritty test of what it means to have faith in another person. In marriage, each person faces the challenge of knowing the self and knowing the spouse, knowing the self's needs and limitations and knowing those of the spouse. Each is challenged to grow up. Partners must renounce both pseudo-saintly claims to martyrdom and pseudo-heroic claims to invulnerable strength. The manipulative powers of dominance and guilt must be set aside and kept aside. That's what's so countercultural about the very relationship that's at the heart of our families, is the fact that that's what we're called to do. We're called to be vulnerable to each other. A friend of mine who is married for many years used to say, it's not about 100%, it's about one person giving 100% and the other person giving 100%. It's about one person giving 200% some days and the other person only doing 60%. And going back and forth, and this reciprocity instead of equality. So these are the waters we swim in, my friends. The question is, how can we live up to a picture of fidelity in the face of all the cultural pressures around weddings and sex and all of the pieces of family values? I don't have the answer to this. All I can say is that to speak in black and white doesn't seem to work well in an age of deep complexity. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. For a long time, one of the practices of the church, very sadly, was that we did not do a very good job of welcoming people who had been divorced into our midst. And we didn't quite know what to do, because Jesus says in the scripture, in, again, the book of Mark, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So the church, in a sense, heard those words and said, you know, that means we're no longer going to welcome divorced people. Now, you and I probably know that from the very first century, one of the ways that divorce has always been a reality. It's something that Christ spoke of because he knew the reality that a man could walk into a village square and say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you 3 times, and your marriage was over, and women were usually at that point in a horrible situation when that would happen. And Jesus speaks to that reality of wanting to reconcile the justice of that. But for the 21st century and for the 20th century, to exercise an exclusionary practice based on these words instead of on Jesus' behavior as well became problematic. So the cultural shift for us has been that as part of the Anglican Church, we are beginning to recognize that all people, all of us, those who are divorced and those who are not, fall short in some way. All of us in one way or another, as we call it in Christianity, sin. So why do we limit that kind of lack of welcome to just divorced people? The revelation has been that Christ welcomed all people, outcasts of his time, and that we as his body must do the same. The church now has come to a new place of offering a right for her members that are going through the pain of divorce. It invites them to admit their failings. It asks them to seek forgiveness from God and to seek forgiveness from each other. And the final action, and I've done this ceremony once with people, and it's very moving, is that the person takes their ring off their finger and gives it back to the spouse. And then if there are children present, they turn to the children as well, asking for forgiveness. And the mercy that is then shown is that you are given absolution and told then that you're not off the hook, that the work is to constantly live into that kind of love. It's a huge step forward. So we can look at things from gray places and say, yeah, this is wrong. Divorce is wrong. It's horrible. I've watched it wreck people. We know that trophy wives and all of the craziness we live with is not new. It was, as Scripture says, there's nothing new under the sun. We've lived with this kind of reality from the dawn of time. We'll continue to live with it because culture continues to be selfish, and God calls us to selflessness. So how do we deal with this? One of the ways that we've chosen to deal with it is by doing a reconciliation service for people. And of inviting people then to think about and to pray about what it is that they've lost in that choosing to renounce their vows. So we continue to have this conversation about divorce, about what constitutes marriage, and I think the biggest piece I want to say is, at least within my own tradition, as we try and look at the salad bowl that is America, as we try to accept people from their authentic place of who they are, is that we don't agree with each other. The biggest debate we have right now, of course, that's going on in the church and in our culture has to do with what we do with same-sex couples. And one of the pieces we've come to as a larger church, and I think that we need to come to as a larger community, is of listening to one another, of having dialogue, disagreeing with respect, and to continue to search for common ground. I guess the thing I want to say too, as I close up here, because I have no idea how long I've droned on, is every week in worship we have a confession of what we have not done to our satisfaction. And the words we have are, we ask God for forgiveness in the things we have done and the things we have left undone. And what I've left undone are children, and a lot of other things. There's a million things we could talk about. But the question that is always at the heart, at least for me, of okay, so we have this constant cultural shift that goes on within history.